Howdy, howdy. Welcome back to my tiny corner of the internet. And so in today's video, I want to touch on a post that I made on my channel about a month ago about how billionaires are building bunkers to escape the problems of what they believe is going to be caused by AI. Okay, so the writing is on the wall. The writing is on the wall with the billionaire bunkers, you know, how they're trying to retreat from civilization, their little rich people cities and all that sort of stuff. You know, the digital surveillance state that they're trying to establish, you know, how much they're trying to use automation for things, how they're talking about how AI is going to cause mass unemployment, okay? You got to understand it from the mentality of the ruling class to really understand their psychology, okay? Even if it's not necessarily true, and I've said why it's not true on this channel. You have to understand that is their logic, okay? So the logic is they're essentially building these doomsday bunkers is because they're trying to prepare for what they see as a crisis. You know, I'm going to be honest with you, they're not even trying to prepare for a crisis. They're just straight up, you know, abandoning American civilization because the fact is they want to run away from the problems that they caused themselves, okay? And so they're running to their little doomsday bunkers. They're trying to set up a mass surveillance state, and they're trying to use every technological thing in the toolbook that they can to basically keep people in line while they basically make this migration. I've got another video talking about Malthusianism and depopulationism coming up too, but this time I want to focus on the role of the state because it was interesting. I have a fair amount of veterans in my audience, you know, people who served in the military, and so the fact is that like a couple of them pointed out in the comment section is that, you know, you can literally just, you know, breach these bunkers, right? One guy pointed it out is that, you know, they think that people, especially ex-vets who have been disenfranchised by the existing state, can't breach these bunkers. Another person talked about how they can quite literally just seal the bunkers, cut off their water supply, electricity, bury them, and quite literally cut off their air supply as well. And so, you know, how this is incredibly stupid, okay? And so a couple of people were asking, you know, they wanted me to make a video on what it'd be like on a hypothetical scenario where there was a revolution or a civil war in the United States. Is because there were a couple of comments, you know, by midwits in my comment section talking about like, oh, well, they have like A-10 Warthog, they have B-2 bombers, you have the whole entire imperialist war machine, the American war machine that could literally cannibalize the American people if it really wanted to. And so, you know, more or less, you know, I want to talk a little bit about the role of the state historically first before I start talking about the possibility of a civil war in this country, okay? So, when the agricultural revolution first began, you had the dawn of civilization itself, the first city-states where people began to settle down from hunter-gatherer nomadic societies, you know, bands of 50 to 100 people, into large-scale city-states where they relied primarily on agriculture and farming to get by. And in those times, there were two types of states that emerged. Okay, there were the ones that were farming, you know, based on crop types. They were farming roots and tubers. And so, you know, they were basically unable to persistently store the crop yield that they had. So the problem was they couldn't really store it. So, you know, that was basically the end of that story, right? But there's one particular type of civilization, one that mostly farmed grain, wheat and sorts and stuff like that. You know, grain farming civilization. They could be persistently storable and used at any point in time. Okay, and so you had the first forms of accumulation where this type of food source essentially was storable indefinitely. You can use it at any point in time, okay? Well, the thing is, when you have giant silos of food that can be accumulated, they can also be appropriated. And so on, you know, along with that, you know, raiders would also become a problem too. Raiders, why would they farm their own stuff? Why would they spend so much time farming stuff when they could just quite literally raid a village, pillage it, burn it to the ground, and steal their grain? You know, and as a consequence of this, the earliest, you know, city-states began forming their own dedicated bands of militias, essentially, of, you know, armed men that were distinctly of the role of fighting, you know, protecting the existing society. You know, this was the earliest formations of state. You know, the earliest, you know, these bands of men would have a monopoly on violence and force within a region, you know, with the exclusive purpose of protecting and reserving, you know, the grain silos that these farming civilizations had. Yes, you had a whole bunch of tertiary things and roles like, you know, priest classes, you know, and stuff like that that emerged with these agricultural civilizations. But you also had the earliest formations of class, you know, property, taxes, and state, is because now you had the concept of a dedicated band of men whose sole role was fighting, and they would give armed protection for these city-states in exchange for a portion of that grain. And essentially, that was the earliest formations of taxes, because the state needed to perpetuate its own existence. And so they relied on the produce of these city-states to actually perpetuate their own existence. And henceforth, you know, this state would ensure the property rights, the exclusionary principle of these grain silos, you know, from the rest of the people, from raiders, from a civilization, right? You know, the first forms of property, the idea of excluding somebody else for the benefit of somebody else, you know, began to be a thing as well. Okay, you know, it's no different today than like if somebody's squatting on your property that you have to call the local police or the county sheriff to basically get them off your property to enforce your exclusive rights over that piece of property at the expense of the rest of society. Private property is a social construct that requires armed men and the state to enforce, to preserve in a sort of sense, because the fact is that, you know, it is a recognition by society that something is exclusively yours at the expense of the rest of society. And so, you know, that is where the earliest forms of state, class, taxes, and private property really began. Okay, and so, you know, throughout civilization, from the slavery mode of production to the tributary mode of production, the feudal mode of production, even to the modern capitalist, liberal, democratic societies that we live in today, you know, this theming is consistent. You know, to respect, to enforce your exclusionary rights over something that requires men of the state, armed men of the state, to enforce your exclusivity over a piece of property. You know, you call on the county sheriff to respect the title and deed that has been afforded to you by the county. You know, that's why the county doles out, you know, these deeds and these titles in recognition of your exclusive right to a particular piece of land within that county, and why armed men enforce your exclusivity over that property. But with that being said, today, you know, while the wealthy are building their doomsday bunkers, right? You know, now that we understand the nature of the state is that it's always been a portion of men who have been armed to the teeth, you know, that have gotten a portion of that grain taxes to ensure the protection and enforcing the private property of the particular ruling classes throughout every mode of production throughout history. Okay, now we understand the state. The state is something. It is a distinct section of society that are armed with the monopoly on violence that enforces the will of the ruling class of every given society. And so, the thing is, the members of the state need to be enfranchised to some degree. Just like 12,000 years ago, the members of the state didn't just protect those grain silos of those farmers for free, they required taxes to ensure that that was actually protected from raiders, okay? And the ruling class is discovering this the very hard way, is because as they're retreating to their doomsday bunkers, you know, and they're basically dealing with their private security, a lot of them are asking the very stupid question that you and I already know, is that if there's no police and military to protect me, what's going to stop my private security guard from putting a bullet in the back of my head and taking all my shit? And the truth is, this speaks down to a fundamental level truth about civilization and human nature itself, is that you have to enfranchise at least some people to basically ensure that there is no rebellion against you, that there is no civil war, that there is no revolution. Essentially, is because the fact is, if people are not enfranchised, what reason do they have to preserve your system? And the ruling class is learning this the hard way. As much as they want to set up digital surveillance things, and they want to basically create a mass surveillance state, and they want to make everybody rentoids in their own country, you know, and selling off the entire American dream of home ownership to Blackstone, Vanguard, and American Homes for Rent, is that this begs the very interesting question is, who's going to protect you from your guards? Because the ruling class is stumbling upon the very classic problem that every Roman emperor throughout history has had to deal with. So, the topic of today's video is, how would this go out? How would a revolution or a civil war play out in the United States? Now that we understand that there's a fundamental thing, this is why I talk about it so much on my channel, is why enfranchisement is such an important model, is because the thing is that if you can't enfranchise your own base, you know, just like the security guard with the rich people in their bunkers, is what's going to stop them if they're not enfranchised from putting a bullet in the back of your head and taking your stuff? And that's where enfranchisement comes in. Okay, your base has to be enfranchised to some degree to stop them from putting a bullet in the back of your head. And so what is a revolution in a civil war? It is no different than that, than the unenfranchised, the disenfranchised masses revolting against the existing system simply because it does not benefit them. Okay, and so this is bringing us into the topic of a civil war and revolution, is because the fact is I've noticed that there is a sentiment growing on my side of the aisle, especially with a bunch of disenfranchised veterans, is because they see the writing on the wall. We have gone through years where the average house price has skyrocketed to $500,000, where we were gaslit about the cost of living, told that only rich people will own property in 50 years' time, while at the same time our jobs lose, you know, their buying power, and our industry is sold off to China, and then our engineering is being outsourced to India. You know, all these things incomplicit to creating an entire disenfranchised base of ordinary people who literally can no longer afford the American dream, is because it's been turned into a rental unit. Okay, and so I see this upcoming rising, you know, sentiment in my own comment section. One person asked, what would be my thoughts on a civil war? And of course, like I said at the beginning of the video, one guy pointed out that, you know, the ruling class has drones and high-tech surveillance, and there's no possibility of rebellion whatsoever. And the fact is they could just unleash the cruelty of the A-10 Warthog and B-2 bombers upon the American people to get them back in line. And the narrative is this, and I've always found this to be a funny narrative, especially when a lot of war hawks basically use that to say that there's no possibility of civil war or revolution in the United States, is that who do you think composes the American military? Oh, that's right, the American people. Ordinary people who join the military for better opportunity to get their lives ahead. And at one point or another, because it composes of itself of the American people, you know, they have to be enfranchised to some degree. And so do you think that they're going to fight? And I opened up another thread talking about how the ruling classes of Britain, you know, are telling young men to abandon college and join the military. Is that, do you think these young men are going to join the military to basically fight on behalf of a ruling class that has quite literally cannibalized its country, hates its own people, outsources its own industry to China, and replaces its own engineering and labor with foreign labor? And so the comments can speak for themselves. Okay, the sentiment is there. Do you think that these people are going to fight for your apparatus? And that's why I titled the video aptly, "Who's going to protect you from your guards, Porky?" Is because the fact is you have large swaths of disenfranchised people. Do you think they're going to fight for Blackstone? Do you think they're going to fight for Vanguard? Do you think they're going to fight for a gaslighting media complex that defends deep state diddlers who diddle children in their mansions while everybody else lives paycheck to paycheck? Well, of course not. And so that's kind of the interesting thing. So when I see a war hawk or somebody who is basically a bourgeois, you know, spokesperson come into my comment section to say that this is an entire impossibility, is that the brutality of the American war machine and all the war crimes it's done, a country that literally breathes in war crimes, is that there would be no possibility for civil war and revolution, I always get kind of a bit of a laugh, is because the fact is it's so tone deaf and daft, is because the American military is composed of ordinary people. And there has never been a civil war in history that has ended up being where, oh, it's the military against the people. That has never been the case. Even in the American Civil War in the 19th century, you had military installations and military bases defecting to the Confederate side of the aisle. So let's rehash this, okay? Especially for the people who are the acolytes of the bourgeois class that antagonize the people in my comment section, that they're saying these talking points, okay? Let's put everything in retrospect. Okay, so A, you basically outsourced their industry to China. You basically deindustrialized the United States because you didn't want to pay American blue-collar workers, you know, domestically, a wage that paced with the growing cost of housing, okay? B, when it came to our white-collar workers in engineering, you outsourced it to India because the fact is you didn't want to pay air engineers a wage that paced with the rising cost of housing in the United States as well. And on top of that, you basically sold out the American dream of home ownership to Blackstone, Vanguard, and American Homes for Rent. And you did this to a country, you know, that quite literally breathes war crimes for a living. It all is committed the Abu Ghraib prison, whatever you want to think of, whatever war crime you can think of the American military doing. You know, you're going to make these people perpetual renters in their homeland, and then you're going to do all these things to these people in the demand that they serve you so you can create your doomsday bunkers that you can retreat to while you try and set up a mass surveillance state, destroy their possibility of home ownership, and, you know, make them perpetual renters in their homelands with no privacy? You really think that you're going to get away with that? So you're going to do all that and expect no backlash at all. Right. So when the Civil War goes on, okay, because you're going to have operators run, you know, using those drones, you're going to have pilots piloting those A-10 Warthogs, and, you know, you're given the orders, you know, there's been an insurrection in the United States, and people are uprising against the existing state that's covering up for deep state diddlers, and you've dispatched the Warthog to basically gun down American citizens. You think that pilot's going to look at that, all that, you know, that they're never going to own their own home. They're never going to be able to settle down, own their own home, have a family, and have a decent life, or even live the American dream. And they're going to live in a 600 square foot studio without never having the ability to have a family, always be surveilled. And you think they're going to be shooting American citizens? Right, they're totally not going to veer off course and start flying over rich people neighborhoods or anything. I don't know where you get this idea that, you know, that there aren't going to be sympathizers within those ranks. It's never been, throughout history, has there ever been a civil war where there's been the American people against the military, or the people against the military. But that's how deranged the ruling class is because the fact is, just like the people in my comment section, when they're talking about running up to these bunkers and they're asking the stupid question is, if there's no police and military to protect me, who's going to stop my guards from putting a bullet in my head? You know, they think that, you know, that unanimously the American military, which is composed of the American people, are going to just gun down American people on their behalf so they can build their doomsday bunkers and have their and set up their surveillance state. Yeah, that's totally going to happen, Porky. Okay, so I want to say this to Bill Gates, Larry Ellison, Larry Fink, and all these different members of the ruling class that think they're going to genuinely get away with this with absolutely no backlash, quite literally hollowing out a country that breathes in war crimes and then running off the bunkers thinking they're going to get away with it. Let's place a bet. Let's see if this goes down your way, you know, over the next 20 years, and let's see if it goes down my ways, because I have a feeling that you're going to have a lot of disenfranchised people. So at the end of the day, you know, who's going to protect you from your guards, Porky? Is because last I checked, you know, screwing over a country that literally breathes in war crimes seems like a really stupid idea, if you ask me. But I'm not one to correct somebody when they're making a mistake, so if they want to do that, then be my guest. But that's just my 2 cents. What do you think is going to happen? Do you think that they're going to get away with it? Do you think the members of the ruling class, Larry Fink, Klaus Schwab, Larry Ellison, and Bill Gates, do you think after they've been implicated on the files, I probably should censor that out, I probably will be censored out, when they've been implicated on all these sorts of things, that people, ordinary people, are just going to let them get away with that while they hollow out the entire country? I think otherwise. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and don't forget to drop a comment if you have an opinion you want to drop. Let me know. Other than that, I'm going to go ahead and close off the videos because I think I've made my point. Y'all have a good day.